farmer stands at the edge of the Nile, watching the water rise. It happens every year. The river swells, spreads across the banks, and leaves behind a dark ribbon of soil. That soil will feed his family. It will feed the pharaoh. It will feed an empire that will last 3,000 years. But the farmer doesn't think about empires. He thinks about the flood. Whether it will come too high or too low, whether the gods are listening, whether his children will inherit this patch of earth. Ancient Egypt wasn't built by pharaohs alone. It was built by farmers like him, by scribes who counted grain, by stonecutters who shaped monuments, by priests who whispered prayers in the dark. For more than 3 millennia, this civilization rose along a single river in the middle of a desert. It created pyramids that still stand, writing that we can still read, art that still moves us. But it also created something harder to see, a way of understanding the world, a rhythm of life tied to water and sun, a belief that death was not an ending, but a transformation, a certainty that order could be preserved if only the right rituals were performed. This is the story of how that world came into being, how it endured through invasion, drought, and civil war, and how it finally faded, leaving behind mysteries we're still trying to solve. The Nile is the longest river in Africa. It flows north for more than 4,000 miles, cutting through desert, savanna, and mountain. But for most of its length, it touches nothing that could be called civilization. Only in its final stretch, the last 600 miles before it reaches the Mediterranean, does the river become something more. Here, the Nile widens into a valley flanked by cliffs. Beyond those cliffs, sand, rock, emptiness. But in the valley itself, there is water, soil, life. The ancient Greeks called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and they were right. Without the river, there would be no fields, no cities, no pharaohs. Every year, the Nile flooded. The water came from rains far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia and East Africa. By the time it reached Egypt, the flood carried rich sediment, a dark, fertile silt that turned the valley black. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, which means the Black Land. Everything beyond the Black Land was Deshret, the Red Land, the desert, the place where nothing grew. The flood wasn't random. It arrived at roughly the same time each year, usually in late summer. It peaked, held, then gradually receded, leaving behind fresh soil. This predictability shaped everything about Egyptian life. Their calendar was built around it. Their economy depended on it. Their entire worldview was organized around the idea that nature, if properly respected, would provide. The Egyptian calendar had 3 seasons: Akhet, the inundation, when the Nile flooded the fields; Peret, the growing season, when crops sprouted and matured; Shemu, the harvest, when farmers gathered grain before the next flood. Each season lasted 4 months. Each month had 30 days. 5 extra days were added at the end of the year, considered unlucky, dangerous even. But the flood could fail. If it came too low, crops withered and famine followed. If it came too high, villages drowned and chaos spread. The difference between abundance and disaster was measured in inches. So the Egyptians watched the river closely. They built nilometers, structures that measured the flood's height. Some were simple marked columns. Others were elaborate staircases descending into the water with measurements carved into the walls. Officials recorded the readings, compared them year to year, tried to find patterns. A good flood meant prosperity, full granaries, satisfied people. A bad flood meant hunger, unrest, sometimes the fall of dynasties. They also prayed to Hapi, the god of the flood, depicted as a man with a large belly and pendulous breasts, symbolizing fertility and abundance; to Osiris, the god of fertility and resurrection, whose death and rebirth mirrored the annual cycle of the flood; to any deity who might ensure the water came at the right time, in the right amount. Before Egypt was a kingdom, it was a collection of villages, small farming communities scattered along the river, each with its own leaders, its own gods, its own sense of identity. Archaeologists call this period the pre-dynastic era. It lasted for more than 1,000 years, from roughly 5000 BCE to 3100 BCE. During this time, something important happened. The villages began to organize. They dug canals to control the floodwaters, to direct water to fields that would otherwise remain dry. They built dikes and levees to protect settlements from excessive flooding. They constructed storage facilities for grain, vast mud brick silos that could hold surplus for years. They also developed a system of writing, simple at first, just marks on pottery to indicate ownership or quantity. A jar marked with 3 lines might contain 3 measures of grain. A pot marked with a particular symbol belonged to a particular family. These marks gradually evolved into more complex symbols, the earliest ancestors of hieroglyphs. But organization required coordination, and coordination required leadership. Over time, some villages became more powerful than others. Perhaps they controlled a particularly fertile stretch of land. Perhaps they had more skilled warriors or craftsmen. Perhaps their leaders were simply more charismatic, more capable of inspiring loyalty. Alliances formed, then broke. Leaders competed for control of the most fertile land, the best access to the river. Archaeological evidence suggests this was often violent. Mass graves from this period show signs of warfare, skulls fractured by maces, bodies pierced by arrows. Gradually, 2 distinct regions emerged. Upper Egypt, the southern part of the valley, narrow and enclosed, stretching from the first cataract at Aswan northward to just south of modern Cairo, and Lower Egypt, the northern delta, where the Nile spread into multiple branches and the land opened into marshes and lagoons. The geography shaped the character of each region. Upper Egypt was more isolated, more conservative, more focused on tradition. Lower Egypt was more cosmopolitan, more exposed to trade and foreign influences. Each region had its own culture, its own chief deity, its own sense of identity. Upper Egypt worshipped the vulture goddess Nekhbet, whose main cult center was at El-Kab. The vulture symbolized protection, mother birds watching over their young. Lower Egypt revered the cobra goddess Wadjet, whose shrine was at Buto in the delta. The cobra symbolized royal power and the ability to strike down enemies. Upper Egypt's crown was white, tall and conical. Lower Egypt's crown was red, with a tall back and a coiled projection at the front. Later pharaohs would wear both crowns combined, the double crown, symbolizing dominion over both lands. Around 3100 BCE, the 2 regions were unified. Exactly how this happened is unclear. Egyptian tradition credits a king named Narmer, sometimes also called Menes, with the conquest. Whether Narmer and Menes were the same person or 2 different rulers whose stories merged over time remains debated. A carved stone pallet, discovered in 1898 at Hierakonpolis, shows Narmer wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. On one side of the pallet, he strikes down an enemy with a mace. The enemy is bearded, possibly a foreigner or a delta chieftain. Narmer is shown much larger than his victim, an artistic convention that would persist throughout Egyptian history, where size indicated importance. On the other side of the pallet, Narmer inspects rows of decapitated bodies. Their heads are placed between their legs, a final humiliation. The imagery is brutal, deliberate. This was not a peaceful unification. This unification marked the beginning of the dynastic period. From this point forward, Egypt would be ruled by pharaohs, kings who claimed not just political authority, but divine status. The word pharaoh itself comes from the Egyptian per-a, meaning great house. Originally, it referred to the palace, not the king, but over time, the term became synonymous with the ruler himself. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god. He was the mediator between the human world and the divine. His role was to maintain Ma'at, order, balance, cosmic harmony. Ma'at was more than a concept. It was a goddess, often depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head. The feather became her symbol, light, delicate, perfectly balanced. But Ma'at was also a principle that governed everything from law to architecture to daily behavior. To live according to Ma'at meant to live in truth, fairness, and balance. It meant speaking truthfully, dealing fairly with others, respecting social hierarchies. It meant performing one's duties, whether as a king or a farmer. To violate Ma'at meant to invite chaos. Isfet, the opposite force, disorder and destruction. Isfet was not just abstract chaos. It manifested as drought, famine, war, disease. It was the crocodile lurking in the reeds, the sandstorm that buried villages, the foreign army at the border. Ma'at was the bulwark against all of it. The pharaoh's primary duty was to uphold Ma'at. He did this through ritual, daily offerings in the temples, festivals that reenacted the creation of the world, ceremonies that ensured the Nile would flood on schedule. Every morning, priests awakened the god's statue, bathed it, dressed it, presented it with food. Theoretically, the pharaoh performed these rituals himself. In practice, priests acted as his proxies. But the pharaoh also upheld Ma'at through governance, maintaining granaries so no one starved, settling disputes fairly, defending the borders against foreign invasion, building monuments that would last forever, demonstrating Egypt's eternal strength. Egypt was now a single nation, but it was a nation defined by its geography. The Nile remained the spine of everything, the source of food, the highway for trade, the boundary between life and death, and the rhythm of the river, flood, growth, harvest, became the rhythm of Egyptian time itself. The first two dynasties are often called the early dynastic period. It was a time of consolidation, of establishing the institutions that would define Egypt for centuries. The capital was established at Memphis, strategically located at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. From Memphis, the pharaoh could control both regions, keep watch over potential rivals, project power up and down the Nile. The city itself was impressive. It had a massive mud brick wall called the White Walls, which gave the city one of its names. Inside the walls, palaces, temples, workshops, storage facilities. Memphis would remain Egypt's administrative capital for most of the Old Kingdom. During this early period, Egyptian art and writing developed rapidly. Hieroglyphs became more standardized, more expressive. Sculptors learned to carve stone with remarkable precision. Architects experimented with different building techniques, gradually mastering the use of stone rather than mud brick. And they began building tombs, not simple graves, but elaborate structures designed to house the dead for eternity. These tombs would evolve, grow larger, more complex, until they became the defining monuments of Egyptian civilization. But that transformation was still to come. Djoser was the second pharaoh of the Third Dynasty. He ruled around 2670 BCE, during a period we now call the Old Kingdom. Before Djoser, Egyptian tombs were simple structures, rectangular brick platforms called mastabas. The name comes from the Arabic word for bench, because that's what they resembled from a distance. These mastabas were functional but unremarkable, a flat-topped mound with a burial chamber below ground and a chapel above where offerings could be made. Kings and nobles alike were buried in mastabas. The only difference was size. Djoser wanted something more. He commissioned a man named Imhotep to design his tomb. Imhotep was not a pharaoh or a priest. He was an architect, a polymath, someone who understood both engineering and ritual. He would later be deified, worshipped as a god of medicine and wisdom. What Imhotep built was unprecedented. He started with a traditional mastaba, then he added another on top of it, slightly smaller, then another, and another. 6 layers in total, each one smaller than the one below, creating a step pyramid. The step pyramid at Saqqara rose nearly 200 feet into the air. It dominated the landscape, visible for miles in every direction. It wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement, a declaration that the pharaoh was more than human, that his death was not an end, but an ascension. The pyramid was a stairway to the heavens, a structure that allowed the king's spirit to climb toward the sun, god Ra. The steps were literal. The king would climb them in the afterlife, rising from the earth to join the gods. But the pyramid itself was only part of a much larger complex. Imhotep surrounded it with a massive limestone wall over 30 feet high. Inside the wall, courtyards, chapels, shrines, administrative buildings. There were dummy buildings too, structures that looked real from the outside but were solid stone inside, serving only symbolic purposes. One courtyard was designed for the Heb Sed festival. This was a ritual of renewal. usually celebrated after a pharaoh had ruled for 30 years. The king would run a course, demonstrating his continued vitality. He would perform rituals reaffirming his right to rule both Upper and Lower Egypt. In Djoser's complex, the courtyard was designed so he could perform these rituals eternally in the afterlife. Imhotep's design became a template. Later pharaohs tried to outdo it. They refined the design, smoothed the steps into sloped sides, perfected the angles. By the 4th dynasty, pyramid construction had reached its peak. The transition from step pyramid to true pyramid didn't happen overnight. There were experiments, failures, learning. The bent pyramid at Dashur shows this clearly. Its lower half rises at a steep angle. Then, about halfway up, the angle suddenly becomes gentler. Why the change? Some archaeologists believe the builders realized the initial angle was too steep, that the structure might collapse. Others suggest they were rushing to complete it before the pharaoh died. Either way, the result is a pyramid that looks oddly bent, as if it's bowing under its own weight. But the lessons learned from the bent pyramid led to perfection. The red pyramid, also at Dashur, has smooth sides from base to apex. It's called red because of the reddish limestone used in its construction. This was the first true smooth-sided pyramid. And then came Giza. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built for Khufu, the second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty. The Greeks called him Cheops. He ruled for around 23 years, from approximately 2589 BCE to 2566 BCE. Building his pyramid took roughly 20 years. It required more than 2 million limestone blocks. Some of these blocks weigh as much as 15 tons. The average block weighs about 2.5 tons. The blocks were quarried nearby, from the Giza plateau itself. Workers cut them using copper tools and stone hammers. Copper is a soft metal, not ideal for cutting stone. But the Egyptians were masters at using what they had. They used wooden wedges driven into cracks, then soaked with water to make the wood expand, splitting the stone. Once cut, the blocks were dragged on sledges. Teams of workers pulled them using ropes. A painting in a Middle Kingdom tomb shows exactly this. Dozens of men pulling a massive statue on a sledge, while another man pours water in front of it. The water reduced friction, making the sledge easier to pull. But how did they lift the blocks? The pyramid rose to a height of 480 feet. Moving blocks to the upper levels required ingenuity. The most likely method involved ramps, not a single straight ramp. That would have to be miles long to maintain a gentle enough slope. Instead, probably a spiral ramp that wrapped around the pyramid as it grew, or perhaps multiple smaller ramps approaching from different sides. Some archaeologists have proposed internal ramps, tunnels built inside the pyramid itself. Thermal scanning has revealed anomalies in the Great Pyramid structure that might support this theory, but nothing has been proven conclusively. When it was finished, the Great Pyramid stood 480 feet tall. For more than 3,000 years, it was the tallest man-made structure on Earth. Only in the Middle Ages, with the construction of great European cathedrals, was it surpassed. Its sides were covered in polished white limestone, called Tura limestone, quarried from across the Nile. This casing stone was fitted so precisely that a knife blade couldn't fit between the blocks. When the sun hit the pyramid, it shone like a beacon, visible for miles across the desert. The tip of the pyramid was capped with a pyramidion, a small pyramid-shaped capstone. Some historians believe it was covered in gold or electrum, a gold-silver alloy. The pyramidion represented a sun ray, frozen in stone. The pyramid itself was a symbol of the sun's rays descending to Earth. But who built it? For a long time, historians assumed the pyramids were built by slaves. Thousands of laborers forced into service, toiling under brutal conditions, driven by whips and fear. This image was popularized by ancient Greek historians like Herodotus, who visited Egypt centuries after the pyramids were built and heard local legends. Recent evidence suggests otherwise. Excavations near the pyramids have uncovered workers' villages. These weren't prison camps. They were organized communities with housing, kitchens, and medical facilities. The workers were fed well. Records show they received daily rations of bread and beer. They ate meat, beef, sheep, goat. They ate fish from the Nile. This was a better diet than most Egyptians enjoyed. Their bones tell stories. They show signs of hard labor, worn joints, compressed vertebrae, healed fractures. But they also show signs of care, broken bones that had been set and healed properly, evidence of medical treatment, even surgery. One skeleton shows a man who had his leg amputated. The bone was cut cleanly, with a copper saw probably. The wound healed, and the man lived for several more years. This level of medical care suggests these were valued workers, not disposable slaves. Many of the workers were probably farmers. During the flood season, when the fields were underwater, they had no work. So they came to the pyramid site, not as slaves, but as participants in a national project. They were paid in food and beer. They worked for a few months, then returned to their farms. Building the pharaoh's tomb was a form of service, a way to contribute to Ma'at, to ensure the continued prosperity of the kingdom. If the pharaoh achieved a successful afterlife, if he joined the gods and maintained cosmic order, then Egypt would thrive. The workers weren't building a tomb, they were securing the future. Graffiti found inside the pyramids supports this view. Work gangs left their marks, boasting about their accomplishments. The crew, friends of Khufu. The crew, drunkards of Menkaure. These were teams competing against each other, proud of their work. The pyramids were more than tombs. They were part of a larger complex. Each pyramid had a mortuary temple on its eastern side, where daily rituals were performed. A causeway connected the mortuary temple to a valley temple near the river. This causeway was covered, its walls decorated with reliefs. The valley temple was where the pharaoh's body first arrived, brought by boat from Memphis. Here, rituals were performed: purification, mummification, preparation for burial. Then the body was carried up the causeway to the mortuary temple, and finally into the pyramid itself. Around the Great Pyramid stood smaller pyramids for queens. Rows of mastabas housed nobles and officials who wanted to be buried near their king. The entire plateau was a vast necropolis, a city of the dead. Inside the Great Pyramid, a series of passages leads to the king's chamber. The entrance is on the north face, about 50 feet above ground level. A narrow descending corridor leads into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. This was probably the original burial chamber, later abandoned in favor of a chamber higher up. From the descending corridor, another passage, the ascending corridor, climbs steeply upward. It's barely 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. You have to crouch or crawl to move through it. The ascending corridor opens into the Grand Gallery. This is one of the most impressive spaces in the pyramid. It's a tall, corbelled corridor, rising at the same steep angle as the ascending passage, but nearly 30 feet high. The walls lean inward as they rise, creating a false arch. At the top of the Grand Gallery is the King's Chamber. It's a small, austere room, about 34 feet long and 17 feet wide. The walls are lined with red granite blocks, each weighing many tons. The granite came from Aswan, more than 500 miles to the south. In the center of the King's Chamber sits a granite sarcophagus. It's empty, no lid, no mummy. When archaeologists first entered the chamber in the 9th century, it was already empty. Whether it was robbed in antiquity or never used remains unknown. The chamber has no decorations, no inscriptions, no hint of what rituals took place there. This is unusual. Later pyramids would be covered with hieroglyphs, the pyramid texts, spells and instructions for the afterlife. But the Great Pyramid is silent. Above the King's Chamber are 5 small spaces, one above the other. These are called relieving chambers, designed to reduce the weight bearing down on the King's Chamber. Without them, the ceiling might have collapsed. But higher up in the pyramid, there are shafts, narrow passages that angle upward from the King's Chamber and from another chamber below it, called the Queen's Chamber. For a long time, archaeologists thought these were air shafts, designed to ventilate the chambers. Now, many believe they were symbolic, passages for the pharaoh's spirit to travel to the stars. The shafts point towards specific stars or constellations. One shaft from the King's Chamber points toward the constellation Orion, which the Egyptians associated with Osiris. Another points toward the circumpolar stars, the imperishable stars that never set. The Egyptians believed the sky was divided into 2 realms: the Duat, the underworld, where the sun traveled at night, where Osiris ruled, and the imperishable stars, the circumpolar stars that never set, that circled the north pole of the sky eternally. The pharaoh's spirit was destined to join those stars, to become immortal, unchanging, eternal. The pyramid itself was a machine for transformation, a device for turning the dead king into a star. After Khufu, his son Khafra built the second pyramid at Giza. It appears taller than the Great Pyramid because it sits on higher ground, but it's actually slightly smaller, 448 feet compared to Khufu's 480. Khafra's pyramid still retains some of its original casing stones at the apex. You can see how the pyramid once looked, smooth, polished, gleaming white. Near Khafra's pyramid stands the Sphinx, a massive limestone statue with the body of a lion and a human face. Most historians believe the face is Khafra's, though some argue it's Khufu, or even an earlier king. The Sphinx was carved from a single outcrop of bedrock. It's 240 feet long and 66 feet high. It faces east, toward the rising sun. The Sphinx has been weathered by wind and sand for more than 4,000 years. At some point, its nose was destroyed. Exactly when or why remains a mystery. Popular legend blames Napoleon's troops, who supposedly used it for target practice, but sketches from before Napoleon's time show the nose already missing. More likely, it was deliberately defaced, perhaps by religious iconoclasts who saw it as a pagan idol, or perhaps by treasure hunters who believed the nose might contain hidden jewels. The Sphinx has been buried and uncovered multiple times throughout history. The desert sand constantly threatens to swallow it. An inscription between its paws tells of a prince who fell asleep in its shadow. The Sphinx appeared to him in a dream, promising him the throne if he cleared away the sand. The prince did so, and later became Pharaoh Thutmose IV. The third pyramid at Giza belongs to Menkaure, Khafra's successor. It's much smaller than the other two, only 213 feet tall, but it was originally faced with red granite, a more expensive and labor-intensive material than limestone. Some of this granite casing remains at the pyramid's base. It gives a hint of how striking the pyramid once appeared, red stone rising from the pale desert. Together, the three pyramids form one of the most recognizable silhouettes in human history. They've inspired wonder, speculation, and countless theories. Some people believe they were built by aliens, or that they contain hidden chambers filled with advanced technology. The reality is both simpler and more impressive. They were built by humans who understood mathematics, engineering, and organization, humans who had a vision of eternity and the determination to make it real. But the age of the Great Pyramids didn't last. After the Fourth Dynasty, pyramid construction declined. Later pyramids were smaller, built with less precision. Some were even filled with rubble and mud brick instead of solid stone blocks. Several factors contributed to this shift. Building a pyramid required enormous resources: stone, labor, food, organization. It required a strong central government capable of mobilizing and coordinating those resources. By the end of the Old Kingdom, that government was weakening. Power began to shift away from the pharaoh and toward regional governors, officials who controlled their own territories, their own armies, their own wealth. These governors were called nomarchs. Each nomarch ruled a nome, a province. Egypt was divided into 42 nomes, 22 in Upper Egypt and 20 in Lower Egypt. At first, nomarchs were appointed by the pharaoh. They served at his pleasure and could be removed if they displeased him. But over time, the position became hereditary. Nomarchs passed their titles to their sons, creating local dynasties. These local rulers became increasingly independent. They kept more tax revenue for themselves. They built their own monuments, sometimes rivaling the pharaohs. They even conducted their own foreign policy, making alliances without the pharaoh's approval. At the same time, the Nile began to fail. A series of low floods led to poor harvests. Food shortages turned into famines. Social unrest spread. The central government couldn't respond effectively. It was too weak, too divided, too consumed by its own internal struggles. By around 2180 BCE, the Old Kingdom had collapsed entirely. Egypt fragmented into competing regions, each ruled by its own warlord or nomarch. The pyramids at Giza stood silent, monuments to a golden age that had passed. But they endured. Through drought and war and centuries of neglect, the pyramids remained. They remained still, weathered, stripped of their outer casing, yet somehow still magnificent, still defying time. When the Old Kingdom fell, Egypt didn't disappear. It fractured. The unified state that had built the pyramids, that had maintained Maat for centuries, suddenly came apart. Regional leaders claimed authority over their territories. Some called themselves pharaohs, though their power extended no further than a few cities. Others styled themselves as nomarchs, or simply as great chiefs. What mattered wasn't the title, but the ability to feed one's people and defend one's borders. This period is called the First Intermediate Period. It lasted roughly a century and a half, from around 2180 BCE to 2040 BCE. For Egyptians at the time, it must have felt like the end of the world. The texts that survive from this era are filled with anxiety and lament. They describe a world turned upside down, where the old certainties no longer hold. One document, called the Admonitions of Ipuwer, describes a kingdom in chaos. The poor have become rich, the rich have become poor. Servants wear fine linen while ladies beg for bread. Tombs have been looted, temples abandoned. The Nile runs with blood, whether literally or metaphorically is unclear. The text is literary, probably exaggerated, but it captures a sense of profound disruption. Maat had failed. The cosmic order that the pharaoh was supposed to maintain had collapsed. But even in chaos, life continued. Farmers still planted crops, though they might not know who would tax them at harvest. Craftsmen still made pottery, wove cloth, built furniture. Markets still operated, though trade networks had been disrupted. Local traditions flourished. Without a central authority enforcing uniformity, different regions developed their own artistic styles, their own burial practices. Some nomarchs commissioned elaborate tombs, decorated with vivid scenes of daily life. These tombs show hunting, fishing, farming, feasting. They reveal a world that was not entirely bleak, despite the political chaos. Gradually, two rival centers of power emerged. One centered in Heracleopolis, a city in the north, near the entrance to the Fayum Depression. The other in Thebes, in the south, about 400 miles up the Nile. The Heracleopolitan rulers controlled Lower Egypt and much of Middle Egypt. They claimed to be the legitimate pharaohs, the true inheritors of the Old Kingdom. They presented themselves as defenders of tradition and order. The Theban rulers controlled Upper Egypt. They were less concerned with legitimacy and more focused on practical power. They built alliances, subdued rival nomarchs, slowly expanded their influence northward. For decades, the two dynasties competed for dominance, sometimes through diplomacy, marriage alliances, trade agreements, sometimes through war. The border between them shifted constantly. A town might be Heracleopolitan one year, Theban the next. Local nomarchs played both sides, switching allegiance depending on who seemed stronger at any given moment. Around 2040 BCE, a Theban pharaoh named Mentuhotep II finally tipped the balance. He defeated the Heracleopolitan rulers in a series of campaigns. He subdued the remaining independent nomarchs. He re-established central authority and declared himself ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt. This marked the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. Egypt was unified once more. But the reunification was fragile. The memory of chaos was still fresh. The nomarchs had tasted independence and were reluctant to give it up entirely. Mentuhotep and his successors had to rebuild Egypt carefully, balancing central authority with local autonomy. Mentuhotep built his mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. It was a unique structure, a terraced temple built against the cliffs, combining elements of traditional tomb architecture with innovative design. Centuries later, Queen Hatshepsut would build her own temple right next to it, clearly inspired by Mentuhotep's vision. The Middle Kingdom is sometimes called Egypt's classical age, not because it was the most powerful period, it wasn't, but because it produced some of the most refined art, the most sophisticated literature, the most carefully articulated philosophy. Middle Kingdom pharaohs were pragmatic. They understood that power couldn't be maintained through monumental building alone. They focused on administration, strengthening the bureaucracy, improving irrigation systems, expanding trade networks. They built fewer pyramids than the Old Kingdom pharaohs. The pyramids they did build were smaller, often constructed with mud brick cores faced with limestone. These pyramids have not survived as well as their Old Kingdom predecessors. Many are now little more than piles of rubble. But the Middle Kingdom pharaohs invested heavily in other projects. They expanded and improved the Fayum region, a natural depression fed by a branch of the Nile. They built dams, canals, and drainage systems, transforming marshland into fertile farmland. This created thousands of acres of new agricultural land, increasing Egypt's food security. They also focused on propaganda. Middle Kingdom texts emphasize the pharaoh's role as protector of the weak. One inscription describes a king who brings bread to the hungry, clothes to the naked, provides for the widow. Whether this reflected reality or aspiration is hard to say. But the message was clear. The pharaoh was not just a divine being removed from ordinary concerns. He was also a shepherd, responsible for the welfare of his people. One of the most important developments of the Middle Kingdom was the democratization of the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh was guaranteed immortality. He alone could join the gods in the sky. Everyone else existed in a kind of shadow realm, dependent on the pharaoh's continued favor. But during the Middle Kingdom, this changed. Texts that had once been exclusive to royal tombs began appearing in the tombs of nobles, officials, even wealthy merchants. These texts are called the coffin texts because they were often painted on the inside of coffins. The coffin texts contained spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, how to avoid the demons who guarded the gates of the underworld, how to answer the questions of the gods, how to transform into different forms, a falcon, a lotus flower, a being of light. The message was revolutionary. Anyone who could afford the proper burial could achieve immortality. Death was no longer the exclusive domain of kings. This shift reflected broader changes in Egyptian society. The First Intermediate Period had weakened the pharaoh's absolute authority. Regional elites had gained power and wealth. They wanted the same guarantees of eternal life that had once belonged only to royalty. The Middle Kingdom also saw a shift in religious focus. Osiris, the god of the underworld and resurrection, became increasingly important. According to myth, Osiris had once been a king of Egypt. He ruled wisely and justly, teaching the Egyptians agriculture and civilization. But his brother Set was jealous. Set murdered Osiris, dismembered his body, and scattered the pieces across the land. Osiris's wife, Isis, searched for the pieces. She found them, all except one, the phallus, which had been eaten by a fish. Using magic, Isis fashioned a replacement and reassembled her husband. She used powerful spells to restore him, not back to life exactly, but into a new form. Osiris became the lord of the dead. He ruled the underworld, the Duat, where the deceased went for judgment. He was both terrifying and merciful, a judge who weighed hearts, but also understood suffering. Before Osiris died, Isis conceived a son, Horus. She raised Horus in secret, protecting him from Set. When Horus came of age, he challenged Set for the throne of Egypt. Their battle was long and fierce. Horus lost an eye, Set lost his testicles. Eventually, the gods intervened and declared Horus the rightful king. Set was cast out into the desert, where he became associated with storms, chaos, and foreign lands. This myth resonated deeply during the Middle Kingdom. It suggested that death was not annihilation, but transformation, that suffering could lead to renewal, that even the broken could be made whole again. Every Egyptian wanted to be like Osiris, to die, to be judged, to be resurrected into eternal life. Funerary texts began referring to the deceased as Osiris, name, Osiris Amenemhat, Osiris Neferu. In death, everyone became Osiris. The cult center of Osiris was at Abydos in Upper Egypt. Egyptians believed this was where Osiris himself was buried. During the Middle Kingdom, Abydos became a major pilgrimage site. Wealthy Egyptians built cenotaphs there, symbolic tombs, not actual burials, but markers of their devotion. Every year, a festival reenacted the death and resurrection of Osiris. A statue of the god was carried in procession, attacked by actors playing Set and his followers, then triumphantly restored. Thousands of people attended, participating in the drama, affirming their faith in resurrection. The Middle Kingdom lasted for roughly 4 centuries. It was a time of relative stability, cultural flourishing, and careful governance. But like the Old Kingdom before it, it eventually weakened. The causes were complex: weak rulers, administrative decay, the eternal tension between central authority and regional power. But there was also external pressure. Groups of Asiatic migrants had been settling in the Nile Delta for generations. They came from Canaan, Syria, and the Levant, traders, craftsmen, laborers seeking better opportunities. At first, they were absorbed peacefully. They adopted Egyptian customs, worshipped Egyptian gods, intermarried with local families. But over time, their numbers grew. By the late Middle Kingdom, entire regions of the Delta were dominated by foreign settlers. They maintained their own languages, their own traditions, their own religious practices. These settlers eventually coalesced into a political entity. The Egyptians called them the Hyksos. The term roughly means rulers of foreign lands, or shepherd kings. Later Egyptian propaganda would portray them as brutal invaders who swept in and conquered Egypt by force. The reality was more nuanced. The Hyksos' rise to power was gradual, more infiltration than invasion. As the Middle Kingdom weakened, as central authority collapsed, the Hyksos filled the vacuum. Around 1650 BCE, the Hyksos seized control of Lower Egypt. They established their capital at Avaris, in the eastern delta. They began styling themselves as pharaohs, adopting Egyptian titles and rituals. Meanwhile, native Egyptian rulers continued to govern Upper Egypt from Thebes. Egypt was divided once again. This period is called the Second Intermediate Period. It lasted roughly a century, from around 1650 BCE to 1550 BCE. Egyptian sources from this era describe the Hyksos as barbaric usurpers. One text claims they ruled without Ra, meaning without divine sanction, without respect for Ma'at. They burned cities, desecrated temples, oppressed the people. But archaeological evidence suggests a more nuanced picture. The Hyksos adopted many Egyptian customs. They used Egyptian titles, worshipped Egyptian gods, particularly Set, whom they identified with their own storm deity. They built monuments in Egyptian style. They also introduced new technologies that would transform Egyptian warfare: bronze working, allowing for stronger weapons and tools; the composite bow, made of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, more powerful than traditional bows; and most significantly, the horse-drawn chariot. The chariot was a revolutionary military technology. It was fast, mobile, and devastating, a platform from which archers could shoot while moving, making them harder to hit. The psychological impact was enormous: the thunder of hooves, the cloud of dust, the speed of the attack. The Egyptians had never seen anything like it, but they learned quickly. When they eventually drove the Hyksos out, they did so using the very technology the Hyksos had introduced. The War of Liberation began in Thebes. The Theban rulers had maintained their independence throughout the Hyksos period. They controlled Upper Egypt and Nubia to the south. They paid tribute to the Hyksos, humiliating but pragmatic. But eventually, a Theban pharaoh named Seqenenre decided to resist. According to legend, the Hyksos king sent him an insulting message. The hippopotamuses in the Theban pools were making so much noise that the Hyksos king couldn't sleep. Could Seqenenre please do something about it? The message was absurd. Thebes was hundreds of miles from Avaris, but the insult was clear. The Hyksos king was asserting dominance, demanding submission. Seqenenre refused. He launched attacks against the Hyksos. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, shows the cost: horrific wounds, multiple axe blows to the skull, a shattered jaw, a broken nose. He likely died in battle, possibly captured and executed. But the war continued. Seqenenre's son, Kamose, took up the fight. Kamose's inscriptions describe a series of campaigns against the Hyksos capital. He burned cities, captured ships, plundered treasure. He boasted of his victories, of his valor in battle. But Kamose died young, possibly in battle. The task of completing the liberation fell to his brother. Ahmose was still a child when he became pharaoh. His mother, Imhotep, likely ruled as regent during his early years. She may have even led troops in battle. One inscription praises her for caring for Egypt's soldiers and bringing back the fugitives. When Ahmose came of age, he resumed the war. Around 1550 BCE, he besieged Avaris. The city fell after a brutal assault. Ahmose pursued the Hyksos as they fled northeast into southern Canaan. He besieged the fortress city of Sharuhen for 3 years. When it finally fell, the Hyksos threat was ended. Egypt was unified once more. Ahmose returned to Thebes in triumph. He had driven out the foreign rulers, avenged his father and brother, restored Ma'at. Ahmose's victory marked the beginning of the new kingdom. It would be Egypt's most glorious era, a time of empire, wealth, and cultural brilliance. But it would also be a time of war. The Egyptians had learned a hard lesson from the Hyksos invasion. Isolation was not safety. To be secure, Egypt would need to control the lands around it. The New Kingdom pharaohs were warriors. They had learned from the Hyksos that Egypt could not simply close its borders and hope to be left alone. If Egypt wanted to be secure, it needed to project power beyond its borders. So they built an empire. They marched north into Canaan and Syria, pushing as far as the Euphrates River. They marched south into Nubia and Kush, extending Egyptian control deep into Africa. They extracted tribute, installed governors, and turned Egypt into the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean world. This imperial expansion was driven partly by security concerns, but it was also driven by economics. The lands to the north provided timber, particularly cedar from Lebanon. Egypt had almost no trees suitable for construction. The lands to the south provided gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. Control of these resources made Egypt wealthy beyond measure, and that wealth was visible. The temples grew larger, more elaborate. The tombs of nobles became palaces for the dead. The royal court glittered with gold and precious stones. Ahmose's successors continued his military policies. His son, Amenhotep I, campaigned in Nubia. His successor, Thutmose I, pushed even further south and also campaigned in Syria. But the greatest military pharaoh of the early New Kingdom was Thutmose III. He ruled for more than 50 years, from around 1479 BCE to 1425 BCE. During that time, he led at least 17 military campaigns into Canaan and Syria. Thutmose III was not initially supposed to be pharaoh. His father, Thutmose II, had several sons. But Thutmose III was the son of a minor wife, not the great royal wife. When Thutmose II died, Thutmose III was still a child. The great royal wife was Hatshepsut, Thutmose II's half-sister. She became regent for the young Thutmose III. But after a few years, she did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh. For about 20 years, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt. Thutmose III was technically co-regent, but he had little actual power. He may have commanded armies during this period. Inscriptions suggest he led at least one campaign, but the real authority rested with Hatshepsut. When Hatshepsut finally died, Thutmose III took full control. He was in his 30s, a mature man who had spent decades waiting, and he exploded into action. His most famous victory came at Megiddo, a fortified city in northern Canaan. Megiddo controlled a crucial pass through the Carmel Ridge. Whoever controlled Megiddo controlled the main route between Egypt and Syria. A coalition of local kings, led by the Prince of Kadesh, had rebelled against Egyptian rule. They gathered their forces at Megiddo. Thutmose marched his army north to meet them. When the Egyptian army reached the Carmel Ridge, Thutmose faced a choice. There were 3 passes through the mountains. 2 were wide and easy, but longer. The third was narrow and dangerous. The army would have to march in single file, but it led directly to Megiddo. Thutmose's advisors urged caution. Take the safer routes, they said. The narrow pass was a trap. If the enemy ambushed them there, the army would be slaughtered. Thutmose disagreed. The enemy would expect them to take the safer routes. They would position their forces accordingly. The narrow pass was dangerous, but it offered surprise. Thutmose led the army through the narrow pass himself, at the head of the column. This was crucial. He was saying, "I will take the same risks I ask of you." The gamble worked. The Egyptian army emerged from the pass unopposed. The rebel coalition, caught off guard, had their forces split between the other two passes. The battle was swift and decisive. The rebel forces scattered. They fled back into Megiddo, pulling the gates shut behind them. If the Egyptian soldiers had pursued immediately, they might have taken the city that day, but they stopped to loot the abandoned camps, gathering weapons, chariots, and treasure. By the time they reached the walls, Megiddo was barricaded. Thutmose besieged the city. He built a moat and a palisade around it, cutting off all supplies. The siege lasted 7 months. Finally, the city surrendered. Thutmose's inscriptions describe the campaign in vivid detail. They list the spoils of war: nearly 900 chariots, 2,000 horses, hundreds of suits of armor, gold and silver vessels, grain and livestock. They also emphasize the pharaoh's personal bravery, his tactical genius, his divine mandate. Thutmose is described as raging like a panther, as fighting with the strength of 100,000 men. This was propaganda, certainly, but it was effective propaganda. Thutmose established himself as not just a competent general, but a legendary warrior. After Megiddo, Thutmose campaigned almost every year. He pushed north into Syria, securing tribute from cities as far as the Euphrates. He campaigned in Nubia, extending Egyptian control southward. He built a network of garrisons and fortresses to maintain Egyptian presence in conquered territories. But empire required more than military strength. It required diplomacy, administration, infrastructure. The New Kingdom pharaohs established a network of vassal states, local rulers who paid tribute to Egypt in exchange for protection and trade access. These vassals were required to send their sons to be educated at the Egyptian court. This served multiple purposes. The young princes learned Egyptian language and customs, becoming cultural ambassadors. But they were also hostages, ensuring their father's loyalty. The pharaohs also married strategically. Princesses from Mitanni, Babylon, and other kingdoms were brought to Egypt and married into the royal family. These marriages created alliances, secured borders, tied distant powers into Egypt's sphere of influence. Letters from this period, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, reveal the complexity of these diplomatic relationships. Kings addressed each other as brother, emphasizing equality even when power dynamics were unequal. They exchanged lavish gifts: gold, horses, chariots, precious stones. They negotiated marriage terms, trade agreements, military alliances. But they also complained. One Babylonian king wrote that the statue Egypt sent him was made of wood covered in gold leaf, not solid gold as promised. He was insulted. Another king complained that Egypt never sent its princesses abroad in marriage, only accepted foreign princesses. The Egyptian response was blunt. A daughter of the king of Egypt is never given to anyone. Wealth flowed into Egypt. Tribute from conquered territories, trade goods from across the Mediterranean, gold from the mines of Nubia. The pharaohs used this wealth to build. The most impressive building projects were at Thebes. On the east bank of the Nile, the pharaohs expanded the temple complex at Karnak. Each ruler added a new hall, a new colonnade, a new pylon gateway. Over centuries, Karnak grew into a vast complex covering more than 200 acres. The hypostyle hall at Karnak is one of the most breathtaking spaces in ancient architecture. It's a forest of columns, 134 massive pillars arranged in 16 rows. The central columns are 70 feet tall and more than 30 feet in circumference. Their capitals are shaped like papyrus flowers, each large enough to hold 50 standing people. Every surface was carved with hieroglyphs and images, gods and pharaohs, battles and rituals. Originally, all of it was painted in bright colors: red, blue, yellow, green. The paint has faded now, but traces remain, hints of how dazzling it once was. Walking through the hypostyle hall, you feel small. The columns tower overhead, their shadows shifting as the sun moves. It's overwhelming by design. meant to inspire awe, to remind you of the gods' power and the pharaoh's connection to them. On the west bank of the Nile, across from Thebes, lay the Valley of the Kings. This desolate valley, hidden among the cliffs, became the royal necropolis. Unlike the Old Kingdom pyramids, these tombs were underground, deep shafts carved into the rock, descending into chambers decorated with spells and images from the afterlife. The tombs were meant to be secret, their entrances hidden or disguised. But secrecy was difficult to maintain. Even in ancient times, tomb robbers found ways to break in. They stole gold, jewelry, anything of value. Sometimes they destroyed the mummies in the process, scattering the pieces, condemning the deceased to oblivion. One pharaoh, however, was luckier than most. Tutankhamun died young. He was probably 18 or 19 years old, though some estimates put him younger. He had ruled for only 9 years, from around 1332 BCE to 1323 BCE. He was not an important pharaoh during his lifetime. He came to power as a child, probably controlled by advisors and court officials. His reign was overshadowed by the religious turmoil that had preceded it. But in death, he became the most famous pharaoh of all. Tutankhamun was probably the son of Akhenaten, though his exact lineage remains uncertain. He was originally named Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, but within a few years of taking the throne, he changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. This name change signaled a dramatic shift. Akhenaten's religious revolution, his attempt to replace the traditional gods with worship of the Aten alone, was being reversed. The old gods were restored, the temples were reopened, the priests reinstated, the capital moved back to Thebes from Akhenaten's desert city. How much of this was Tutankhamun's decision, and how much was decided for him by his advisors, we don't know. He was very young, possibly only 8 or 9 when he became pharaoh. The most powerful figure at court was probably Ai, an elderly official who had served under Akhenaten. Ai may have been Nefertiti's father, making him Tutankhamun's grandfather. He would eventually succeed Tutankhamun as pharaoh. Another powerful figure was Horemheb, the commander of the army. He would later succeed Ai and work to erase all traces of the Amarna period. Tutankhamun married Ankhesenamun, probably his half-sister. Royal incest was common in Egypt, a way to keep the bloodline pure. They had 2 daughters, but both were stillborn or died shortly after birth. Their tiny mummified bodies were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. Then Tutankhamun himself died. The cause of death has been debated for decades. When his mummy was first examined, archaeologists found what appeared to be a blow to the back of the head. This led to speculation that he was murdered. Recent CT scans tell a more complex story. Tutankhamun had a broken leg, fractured shortly before his death. The break became infected. He also showed signs of malaria and genetic disorders, likely the result of generations of inbreeding. The most likely scenario: Tutankhamun broke his leg, perhaps in a chariot accident. The wound became infected. Already weakened by malaria and congenital conditions, he couldn't fight off the infection. He died young, leaving no heir. His death created a crisis. Ankhesenamun, his widow, was still young. According to some historians, she wrote a letter to the Hittite king, Egypt's rival, asking him to send one of his sons to marry her. The Hittite king was suspicious. Was this a trap? But eventually, he sent a prince. The prince never arrived in Egypt. He was killed on the journey, possibly by Egyptian agents who didn't want a foreign king. Ankhesenamun disappears from the record after this. She may have been forced to marry Ai, the elderly official who succeeded Tutankhamun, or she may have died. We don't know. Tutankhamun was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb was probably not originally intended for him. It's much smaller than other royal tombs, hastily prepared. Perhaps he died unexpectedly, and his advisors had to repurpose a tomb meant for a noble. But that small tomb, easily overlooked, would be his salvation. For more than 3,000 years, Tutankhamun's tomb remained undisturbed. Other tombs in the Valley of the Kings were robbed repeatedly, their treasures looted, their mummies desecrated. But Tutankhamun's tomb was hidden. Debris from the excavation of later tombs covered its entrance. Workers building the tomb of Ramesses VI unknowingly piled rubble over Tutankhamun's doorway. By the early 20th century, most archaeologists believed the Valley of the Kings had been thoroughly explored. All the royal tombs had been found. But a British archaeologist named Howard Carter disagreed. Carter had been working in the valley for years, funded by a wealthy patron, Lord Carnarvon. He was methodical, obsessive even. He believed one more royal tomb remained undiscovered, the tomb of Tutankhamun. By 1922, Carnarvon was ready to give up. Years of digging had yielded nothing. The work was expensive, the results disappointing. He told Carter this would be the final season. On November 4th, 1922, Carter's workers uncovered a stone step cut into the bedrock, then another step, and another. 12 steps led down to a sealed doorway. The doorway bore the seal of the royal necropolis, a jackal above 9 bound captives. Carter cleared enough to see a name, Tutankhamun. He telegrammed Carnarvon immediately. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Carnarvon rushed to Egypt. On November 26th, they opened the doorway. Behind it was a corridor filled with rubble. It took a full day to clear. At the end of the corridor was another sealed door. Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner. He held up a candle and peered inside. Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." The room beyond, the antechamber, was filled with objects: golden furniture, alabaster vases, chariots, beds shaped like animals, everything piled haphazardly, as if thieves had entered and been interrupted. Actually, tomb robbers had entered, probably twice in antiquity, but they hadn't gotten far. They may have been caught or scared off. Officials had resealed the tomb, and it had lain undisturbed ever since. It took Carter nearly a decade to excavate and catalogue everything. More than 5,000 objects were found in the tomb. There was jewelry, rings, necklaces, bracelets, earrings, all in gold, inlaid with precious stones. There were weapons, bows, arrows, daggers, one with a blade made from meteoric iron. There were clothes, tunics, sandals, gloves. There were foods, jars of wine, bread, dried meat, honey. There were shabtis, hundreds of small servant figurines meant to perform labor in the afterlife. There were model boats, meant to carry the king through the waters of the underworld. There were the mummies of his stillborn daughters, preserved and buried with him. And there were 3 nested coffins. The outer 2 were made of wood covered in gold leaf. The innermost coffin was solid gold. It weighed more than 200 pounds. Inside the golden coffin lay Tutankhamun's mummy. His face was covered with a golden mask. The mask is one of the most iconic images in the world. A serene, idealized face with inlaid eyes of obsidian and quartz. The headdress is striped blue and gold, representing the pharaoh's authority over Upper and Lower Egypt. The tomb's discovery made headlines worldwide. Tutmania swept the globe. Egyptian motifs appeared in fashion, architecture, design. Movies were made, books written, songs composed. The discovery also sparked rumors of a curse. Lord Carnarvon died in April 1923, less than 5 months after the tomb was opened. The cause was blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite, but newspapers seized on it, the curse of the Pharaohs. In fact, most people involved in the excavation lived long lives. Carter himself lived to 74. There was no curse, only coincidence and sensational journalism. Tutankhamun was not an important pharaoh during his lifetime. He accomplished little, died young, left no lasting impact on Egyptian history. But his tomb, preserved by chance, gave the world an unprecedented glimpse into the wealth and artistry of the new kingdom. It showed us what all the other royal tombs once contained before they were looted, and it made a forgotten boy king into the most famous pharaoh of all. To understand Tutankhamun, you need to understand what came before him. You need to understand Akhenaten. Amenhotep IV became pharaoh around 1353 BCE. He inherited a wealthy, stable kingdom at the absolute height of its power. Egypt's empire stretched from Nubia to Syria. Tribute poured in from vassal states. The treasury overflowed with gold. Within a few years, Amenhotep would transform Egypt in ways that shocked his contemporaries and still puzzle historians. The change began with religion. Traditional Egyptian religion was polytheistic, hundreds of gods, each with their own myths, their own temples, their own rituals. At the top of the pantheon was Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. Amun had begun as a local deity of Thebes, but as Thebes rose to prominence, so did Amun. He merged with Ra, the ancient sun god, becoming Amun-Ra, the hidden one whose power sustained the cosmos. The priests of Amun were immensely powerful. They controlled vast estates, collected enormous wealth from temple offerings and donations. The high priest of Amun rivaled the pharaoh in influence. Some historians believe the priesthood had become too powerful, that they threatened royal authority. Amenhotep IV rejected this entire system. He declared that there was only one god, the Aten, not Ra the sun god, not Amun, the hidden one. The Aten was the sun disk itself, the physical disk in the sky, the source of all light and life. This was radical. The Aten had existed in Egyptian religion before, but always as a minor aspect of Ra. Now Amenhotep elevated it above all other gods. Indeed, he declared the other gods didn't exist. He changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, or servant of the Aten. His wife Nefertiti changed her name to Nefer-Neferuaten Nefertiti. Beautiful are the beauties of Aten, the beautiful one has come. Akhenaten didn't just promote the Aten, he actively persecuted the old gods. He closed the temples of Amun and other deities. He disbanded their priesthoods. He redirected their wealth to the worship of the Aten. Agents went throughout Egypt, chiseling out the name of Amun from monuments. They defaced images of the gods. They even targeted the plural word gods, replacing it with God. The persecution extended to Akhenaten's own ancestors. His father's name was Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied. The name Amun appeared in it, so it too was chiseled away from inscriptions. Then Akhenaten did something even more dramatic. He abandoned Thebes entirely. He built a new capital in the middle of the desert, on virgin land that had never been dedicated to any god. He called it Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten. Today we call it Amarna. The site was in Middle Egypt, on the east bank of the Nile. It was bordered by cliffs on 3 sides and the river on the 4th. Akhenaten marked the city's boundaries with a series of stelae carved into the cliffs. These boundary markers contained inscriptions describing his vision for the city. The city was built rapidly. Within a few years, it had palaces, temples, residential districts, administrative buildings. The Great Temple of the Aten was unlike any temple Egypt had seen before. Traditional Egyptian temples were dark, enclosed spaces where gods dwelt in secret. The Great Temple was open to the sky. Sunlight poured in, illuminating hundreds of offering tables. The entire court moved to Akhetaten. Officials, nobles, scribes, craftsmen, everyone followed the pharaoh to his new city. They had little choice. To remain in Thebes was to defy the king. Akhenaten's revolution was not just religious, it was artistic and cultural. Traditional Egyptian art followed strict conventions that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Figures were idealized, proportions standardized, poses rigid and formal. Amarna art broke all these rules. Akhenaten is depicted with an elongated face, thick lips, a protruding belly, wide hips, spindly limbs. Some scholars believe these depictions reflect a medical condition, perhaps Marfan syndrome or a hormonal disorder. Others argue it's deliberate stylization, a way to emphasize the pharaoh's unique, almost alien nature. Nefertiti appears frequently in Amarna art, far more than previous queens. She's shown in intimate moments with Akhenaten, kissing him, sitting on his lap, playing with their daughters. There's a warmth, a humanity, that's absent from earlier royal art. One famous relief shows the royal family beneath the sun disk. The Aten's rays extend downward, each ending in a tiny hand. Some hands hold ankhs, symbols of life, to the noses of the royal family, giving them the breath of life. The message is clear. Only through the Aten, and only through Akhenaten, comes life. A famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered at Amarna, shows the queen in stunning detail. Her face is elegant, symmetrical, serene. She wears the tall blue crown unique to her. One eye is inlaid with crystal, the other socket deliberately left empty. Perhaps the bust was a sculptor's model. Akhenaten composed hymns to the Aten. One has survived, carved on the walls of courtiers' tombs. It's a beautiful text, poetic and sincere. The hymn describes the sun rising over the earth, bringing life to all creatures, how darkness falls when the Aten sets, and the world becomes still and fearful, how light returns at dawn, and the world awakens. Birds sing, fish leap, plants grow. The hymn emphasizes the Aten's universal power. It gives life not just to Egypt, but to all lands, all peoples. It creates the embryo in the womb, nurtures the chick in the egg, gives breath to all living things. The hymn has been compared to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible. The parallels are striking. Both praise a creator God who made the world and sustains it. Whether there's a direct connection remains debated. Some scholars suggest the psalm was influenced by Egyptian religious ideas. Others argue the similarities reflect universal human responses to the natural world. But Akhenaten's religious vision was also deeply authoritarian. The Aten did not speak directly to the people. It spoke only to Akhenaten, and Akhenaten in turn mediated between the Aten and humanity. This made Akhenaten's position even more absolute than traditional pharaohs. Before, the pharaoh was one god among many, albeit the most important. Now, with only one god and only one intermediary, Akhenaten held total spiritual power. But while Akhenaten focused obsessively on his religious revolution, Egypt's empire began to crumble. Letters from vassal states in Canaan and Syria arrived at Akhenaten. These letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, have been preserved. They're known as the Amarna letters. The letters are desperate. Local rulers write that they're under attack, that Egyptian authority is collapsing, that without military support, they cannot maintain loyalty to Egypt. One ruler writes, "If no troops come in this year, all the lands of my lord the king will be lost." Another writes, "My lord knows that I cannot resist alone." Another, "The king my lord should know that all the lands are at peace with one another, but I am at war." Akhenaten's responses, if he sent any, were inadequate. Egypt's influence in the Near East weakened. Rival powers, especially the Hittites in Anatolia, moved to fill the vacuum. Cities that had been Egyptian vassals for generations defected to the Hittites. Egyptian garrisons were withdrawn or overrun. The empire that Thutmose III had built, that had taken decades of campaigning to establish, was disintegrating. Why didn't Akhenaten respond? Some historians argue he was a pacifist, more interested in spiritual matters than military conquest. Others suggest he was simply incompetent, overwhelmed by the demands of kingship. Still others believe he was distracted, so focused on his religious vision that everything else seemed unimportant. At home, resistance to Akhenaten's reforms grew. The priests of Amun, stripped of power and wealth, seethed. Ordinary Egyptians, cut off from the gods they had worshipped for generations, felt adrift. Nobles and officials, forced to abandon their homes in Thebes and Memphis for Akhenaten's desert city, resented the upheaval. Nefertiti disappears from the record around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. Some historians believe she died. Others suggest she fell from favor, perhaps because she disagreed with Akhenaten's policies. Still others argue she continued to rule under a different name, perhaps even as co-regent or sole ruler for a time. Akhenaten's reign lasted 17 years. When he died, around 1336 BCE, his religious revolution died with him. His immediate successor was probably Smenkhkare, a shadowy figure about whom almost nothing is known. Some historians believe Smenkhkare was actually Nefertiti ruling under a male name. Others identify Smenkhkare as a younger son or co-regent. Then came Tutankhaten, the boy who would become Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was only 9 years old when he became pharaoh. He was surrounded by powerful advisors who pushed him to reverse his father's policies. Within a few years, the old gods were restored. A stela from Tutankhamun's reign describes the restoration. It says the temples of the gods had fallen into ruin, their shrines had been abandoned, their courtyards had become overgrown. The gods had turned away from Egypt. When the army marched to war, it met defeat. When people prayed, the gods did not answer. Tutankhamun repaired the temples, restored the priesthoods, returned the offerings. He changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun. The capital moved back to Memphis and Thebes. Akhetaten was abandoned. Its inhabitants left, taking what they could carry. The city was left to decay in the desert. After Tutankhamun, a brief power struggle ensued. I, the elderly official, ruled for 4 years. Then Horemheb, the military commander, seized power. Horemheb worked systematically to erase all traces of the Amarna period. Monuments were dismantled, their stones reused for other projects. Inscriptions were defaced, names were erased from king lists. In later Egyptian records, the years from Akhenaten to I are sometimes omitted entirely. King lists jump from Amenhotep III to Horemheb. It's as if Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and the others never existed. The official explanation: these were not legitimate pharaohs. They had violated Ma'at, abandoned the gods, ruled without divine sanction. They were heretics whose names deserved to be forgotten. But Akhenaten's legacy lingered in subtle ways. His religious experiment, though rejected, had asked profound questions. Could there be one god instead of many? Could a pharaoh challenge millennia of tradition? Could art break free from ancient conventions? These questions wouldn't be answered in Egypt, but they would echo through history in other places, other times. Monotheism would return in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Revolutionary leaders would challenge tradition in the name of new visions. Artists would rebel against rigid conventions. Whether Akhenaten influenced any of these later developments is uncertain. His city was abandoned, his memory suppressed. But the questions he raised about power, divinity, tradition, change, those questions are eternal. And in the desert, beneath the sand, Akhetaten waited to be rediscovered, waited to tell its story to a world that had forgotten it ever existed. After the chaos of the Amarna period, Egypt needed stability. It found it in the 19th dynasty, particularly under a pharaoh who would come to embody everything Egypt imagined itself to be. Ramesses II ruled for 66 years, from around 1279 BCE to 1213 BCE. He is often called Ramesses the Great, and the title fits. He built more monuments, fathered more children, and fought more battles than almost any other pharaoh in history. But his reputation was built as much on propaganda as on genuine achievement. Ramesses understood the power of image. He knew that history is written by those who control the narrative. His most famous military campaign was against the Hittites. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, controlled much of Syria. This brought them into direct conflict with Egypt, which considered Syria part of its traditional sphere of influence. The tensions had been building for decades. During Akhenaten's reign, Egypt had lost control of many Syrian cities. The Hittites had filled that vacuum. Ramesses' father, Seti I, had campaigned in Syria, trying to reassert Egyptian authority, but the conflict remained unresolved. In 1274 BCE, in year 5 of his reign, Ramesses marched north with a large army. His target was Kadesh, a fortified city on the Orontes River in Syria. Kadesh was strategically vital. Whoever controlled it controlled the routes between Egypt and Anatolia. Ramesses divided his army into 4 divisions, each named after a god: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. He personally commanded the Amun division, which marched at the front. As the Egyptian army approached Kadesh, 2 Bedouin tribesmen were brought before Ramesses. They claimed to be deserters from the Hittite army. They told Ramesses that the Hittite king, Muwatalli, was still far to the north, near Aleppo. He was afraid to fight and had retreated. Ramesses believed them. It was a fatal mistake. The 2 men were Hittite spies. The Hittite army wasn't north of Kadesh. It was hidden behind the city, on the opposite bank of the river. Muwatalli had set a trap. Ramesses, confident that the city was undefended, pushed forward rapidly. His army became strung out, with large gaps between the divisions. The Amun division crossed the river and made camp northwest of Kadesh. The Ra division was still crossing. The other two divisions were miles behind. Then the Hittites struck. Muwatalli sent his chariots across the river. They smashed into the Ra division while it was still in marching formation. The Ra division broke and fled. Hittite chariots pursued them straight into Ramesses' camp. Chaos erupted. Egyptian soldiers scattered in panic. The camp was overrun. For a moment, it seemed the entire army might collapse. What happened next depends on whose account you believe. According to Ramesses' own inscriptions, he single-handedly turned the tide of battle. Finding himself surrounded by enemies, abandoned by his troops, he called out to Amun. The god heard his prayer and filled him with divine strength. Ramesses mounted his chariot. He charged into the enemy alone. He made 6 charges, cutting through the Hittite forces like a god made flesh. He killed countless enemies with his own hands. His arrows never missed. He was invincible. The inscriptions describe it in epic terms. Ramesses fought like a lion, like a falcon, like the god Montu himself. The Hittites fled before him in terror. But this is propaganda. A more realistic account suggests what probably happened. Ramesses did rally his personal bodyguard. He did lead a counterattack. But the crucial factor was reinforcements. A group of Egyptian troops called the Narration, possibly elite forces or allied mercenaries, arrived from the coast. They hit the Hittite chariots from the flank. At the same time, remnants of the Ra division regrouped and rejoined the fight. The Hittites, who had stopped to loot the Egyptian camp, found themselves suddenly under pressure. They withdrew back across the river. The next day, fighting resumed, but both sides were exhausted. Neither could gain a decisive advantage. Eventually, both armies withdrew. Ramesses marched back to Egypt. Muwatalli remained in control of Kadesh. By any objective measure, the battle was not an Egyptian victory. Ramesses had been ambushed, his army nearly destroyed. He failed to capture Kadesh. The strategic situation remained unchanged. But Ramesses declared it a triumph. He had temples and monuments across Egypt carved with accounts of the battle. He commissioned a poetic version, called the Poem of Pentor, that was copied and recopied. He made Kadesh the defining moment of his reign. And in a sense, he succeeded. For thousands of years, Kadesh was remembered as Ramesses' great victory. Only modern archaeology, by recovering Hittite records, revealed the truth. The conflict with the Hittites continued for another 15 years. Small-scale raids, border skirmishes, proxy wars fought through vassal states. Neither side could gain the upper hand. Finally, around 1259 BCE, Egypt and the Hittites signed a peace treaty. It's one of the oldest surviving diplomatic agreements in history. Copies exist in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. The treaty established borders. It created a mutual defense pact. If either kingdom was attacked by a third party, the other would send military aid. It included provisions for extraditing fugitives and political refugees. It even had clauses about how extradited refugees should be treated. They shouldn't be punished for fleeing. The treaty was sealed with a marriage alliance. Ramesses married a Hittite princess, daughter of the Hittite king. She was given an Egyptian name, Mathona-Farura, and integrated into the royal household. Years later, he married another Hittite princess. But by then, Ramesses had so many wives that one more made little difference. Ramesses had more than 100 children. The exact number is uncertain. Some sources say over 150. He had 8 principal wives and dozens of secondary wives and concubines. His favorite wife was Nefertari. She appears frequently in early monuments, often shown the same size as Ramesses, a sign of respect unusual for queens. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most beautiful in Egypt. Its walls are covered with vibrant paintings showing Nefertari's journey through the afterlife. But Nefertari died relatively young, probably in her 40s. After her death, another wife, Isetnofret, became prominent. She was the mother of Ramesses' eventual successor, Merneptah. Many of Ramesses' sons predeceased him. When you rule for 66 years, you outlive your heirs. His 13th son, Merneptah, was already in his 60s when he finally inherited the throne. Ramesses was also a prolific builder. He constructed temples across Egypt, from the Delta to Nubia. But he was not above taking credit for others' work. He often usurped older monuments, having his name carved over the names of previous pharaohs. His most famous monument is the temple at Abu Simbel. It's located in southern Egypt, near the border with Nubia. The temple was carved directly into a cliff face. The facade is dominated by 4 colossal statues of Ramesses. Each statue is over 60 feet tall. They sit enthroned, gazing out over what was once the Nile, now Lake Nasser. The statues are imposing, almost overwhelming. They declare in stone, "This is Egypt's border, and Egypt is mighty." Inside the temple, a series of chambers extends deep into the rock. The walls are covered with reliefs showing Ramesses in battle, making offerings to the gods, receiving divine blessings. The innermost sanctuary contains 4 seated statues: Ptah, Amun-Ra, Ramesses himself, and Ra-Horakhti, Ramesses seated among the gods as an equal. Twice a year, on specific dates, sunlight penetrates deep into the temple. It illuminates the statues in the sanctuary, all except Ptah, the god of darkness, who remains in shadow. The dates were probably calculated to coincide with significant events, perhaps Ramesses' birthday or coronation anniversary. Modern scholars aren't certain of the exact significance. In the modern era, Abu Simbel faced destruction. When the Aswan High Dam was built in the 1960s, it created Lake Nasser. The rising waters threatened to submerge the temple forever. An international effort, coordinated by UNESCO, saved it. Engineers cut the entire temple into blocks. They moved it, piece by piece, to higher ground. They reassembled it exactly as it had been, now 200 feet higher and 600 feet back from the water. The project took 4 years and cost $40 million, but Ramesses' monument survived. Ramesses died around 1213 BCE, probably in his 90s. He had outlived most of his children, many of his grandchildren, even some great-grandchildren. His mummy, discovered in the royal cache in 1881, shows an old man with white hair and arthritis. But in his monuments, Ramesses is forever young, forever victorious, forever divine. That's how he wanted to be remembered. And for the most part, that's how he was. After Ramesses II, Egypt slowly weakened. The decline was not sudden, not dramatic. It was a gradual erosion, a long slide from dominance to vulnerability. Ramesses' son Merneptah inherited the throne as an elderly man. He ruled for only about 10 years, from around 1213 BCE to 1203 BCE. During his reign, Egypt faced a new threat. Groups of foreign invaders began attacking coastal cities across the eastern Mediterranean. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain mysterious. Some may have come from Anatolia, others from Greece or the Aegean Islands, still others from Sicily or Sardinia. These invaders didn't just raid, they migrated. They brought families, livestock, entire communities. They moved by both land and sea, overwhelming cities, toppling kingdoms. Merneptah managed to repel an attack on the western delta. Libyans, allied with some Sea Peoples groups, had invaded. Merneptah's forces defeated them in a 6-hour battle. His victory inscription, carved on a massive stone stele, lists the defeated peoples. It boasts of thousands of enemy dead, prisoners taken, treasure seized. The inscription also contains a passing reference to Israel. It's mentioned among a list of defeated Canaanite peoples. This is the first known reference to Israel outside the Bible. The Merneptah stele, as it's called, has been endlessly debated by scholars trying to connect it to biblical narratives. But Merneptah's victory was only temporary. The Sea Peoples would return. After Merneptah's death, Egypt entered a period of confusion. Several short-lived rulers claimed the throne. There may have been civil war. The chronology becomes murky. Eventually, a pharaoh named Ramesses III established control. He founded the 20th dynasty around 1186 BCE. Ramesses III consciously modeled himself on Ramesses II. He even took the same throne name. He wanted to be seen as a restorer, bringing back the glory of the earlier Ramesses' reign. Around year 8 of his reign, the Sea Peoples launched another massive assault. This time, they came in unprecedented numbers. They had already destroyed the Hittite Empire. They had sacked cities across Cyprus, Syria, and Canaan. Now they turned toward Egypt. Ramesses III prepared carefully. He fortified the delta. He mobilized his army and navy. The Sea Peoples attacked by both land and sea. Ramesses met them on both fronts. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu depicts the battles in dramatic detail. Relief carvings show ships clashing in the delta, Egyptian archers firing from the shore, enemy vessels capsizing, warriors drowning. Other scenes show land battles, Egyptian chariots charging into enemy formations, prisoners being led away in chains, their hands bound. The inscriptions claim total victory. Egypt had triumphed over the greatest threat it had ever faced. Ramesses had saved civilization itself. But the reality was more ambiguous. Egypt had survived, yes, but at enormous cost. The wider Mediterranean world had changed fundamentally. The Hittite Empire was gone, its cities burned and abandoned. The Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece had collapsed into what would be called the Greek Dark Ages. Trade networks that had connected the region for centuries were shattered. Egypt had lost its empire. The territories in Syria and Canaan were gone. Egypt now controlled only the Nile Valley and parts of Nubia. And within Egypt itself, problems multiplied. During Ramesses III's reign, workers building royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings went on strike. It's one of the first recorded labor strikes in history. The workers hadn't been paid their rations. For weeks they had received no grain, no oil, no fish. They had families to feed. So they stopped working. They marched to the office of the local administrator. They sat down and refused to leave until their demands were met. Officials tried to placate them with promises. The workers didn't budge. Eventually, after several days, partial payment was made. The workers returned to their tasks. But they struck again the next month, and again after that. The strikes continued for years. Records of the strikes have survived on papyrus and ostraka, pottery shards used as notepaper. They reveal a government in crisis, unable to pay its workers, unable to maintain basic functions. Tomb robbery became endemic. Even royal tombs were violated, their treasures stolen, the mummies desecrated. Court records from the late New Kingdom describe trials of tomb robbers. The accused included priests, guards, local officials. People who were supposed to protect the tombs were robbing them instead. One record describes a robber confessing under torture. He and his accomplices had broken into a royal tomb. They stripped the gold from the coffins, the jewelry from the mummy. They burned the wooden coffins to extract the gold overlay. Then they divided the loot and went home. The court records reveal systematic corruption. Officials took bribes to look the other way. Witnesses lied to protect accomplices. The entire system was breaking down. Ramesses III himself died under mysterious circumstances. Documents discovered in the 20th century describe a conspiracy. One of his minor wives, Tia, plotted to kill him and place her son on the throne. The conspirators used magic. They made wax figurines and recited spells meant to weaken the pharaoh, but they also took more direct action. Whether Ramesses was actually killed is uncertain. He may have died of natural causes around the same time the conspiracy was unfolding, or the assassins may have succeeded. Recent CT scans of his mummy show evidence of violence, a deep cut across his throat, severing the windpipe, a wound that would have been instantly fatal. The conspirators were caught and tried. Many were executed. Some were allowed to commit suicide, a more honorable end. Tia's son, the would-be usurper, was probably among those forced to take their own lives. After Ramesses III, a series of weak pharaohs ruled. They all took the name Ramesses, Ramesses IV through Ramesses XI, but they ruled in name only. Real power shifted elsewhere. The high priests of Amun at Thebes grew increasingly wealthy and independent. They controlled vast estates, commanded their own armies. At times, the high priest wielded more authority than the pharaoh. Around 1070 BCE, the New Kingdom ended. Egypt split once again. The north was ruled from Tanis by pharaohs of the 21st dynasty. The south was controlled by the high priests of Amun, ruling from Thebes as a separate state. This period is called the Third Intermediate Period. It would last more than 4 centuries. During this time, Egypt was invaded repeatedly. Libyan chiefs seized control of the delta, founding the 22nd dynasty. Nubian kings from the south conquered Thebes and claimed the title of pharaoh. For a brief period in the 8th century BCE, Egypt was ruled by the 25th dynasty, Nubian pharaohs. These rulers saw themselves as protectors of traditional Egyptian religion. They built pyramids, not in Egypt, but in their homeland, in what is now Sudan. Their pyramids were smaller than those at Giza, steeper in angle, but they were pyramids nonetheless, echoes of an older age, built by people who saw themselves as Egypt's true heirs. But even the Nubian pharaohs could not restore Egypt's former glory. A new power was rising in the east, Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was unlike anything the world had seen before. It was a military machine, efficient and brutal. Its armies swept across the Near East, conquering everything in their path. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. He marched down the coast, defeated the Egyptian forces, and captured Memphis. The Nubian pharaoh Taharqa fled south to Thebes. Esarhaddon declared himself ruler of Egypt. He took Egyptian titles, performed Egyptian rituals, but he was not pharaoh in the traditional sense. He was a conqueror. For the next few decades, Egypt was an Assyrian province. Assyrian governors ruled the major cities. Local Egyptian nobles were allowed to maintain their positions, but only as collaborators. But Assyrian control was tenuous. Egypt was far from the Assyrian heartland. Maintaining garrisons was expensive and difficult. The Assyrians relied on local collaborators. One was a man named Psamtik, ruler of Sais, a city in the western delta. Psamtik was appointed by the Assyrians to help govern Egypt. But Psamtik had his own ambitions. As Assyria weakened, consumed by internal revolts and external pressures, Psamtik saw an opportunity. Around 656 BCE, he declared independence. He had help, Greek mercenaries, hired to fight for him. These Greek soldiers were skilled, disciplined, and loyal to whoever paid them. Psamtik used them to defeat his rivals. One by one, he brought the delta cities under his control. Then he marched south and captured Thebes. Egypt was unified once more. Psamtik founded the 26th dynasty. This period is called the Sate period, after Psamtik's capital at Sais. It was a time of cultural revival. The Sate pharaohs looked backward. They revived old traditions, copied old kingdom art, restored ancient temples. They presented themselves as restorers of Ma'at, bringers of stability after centuries of chaos. For a time, it worked. Egypt experienced a renaissance. Trade flourished. Cities grew. Art and literature thrived. The Sate pharaohs encouraged foreign trade. Greek merchants established trading posts in the delta. The city of Naucratis became a major Greek settlement, a hub for Mediterranean commerce. Greek influence seeped into Egyptian culture. Egyptian art began incorporating Greek elements. Some Egyptians learned to speak Greek. The two civilizations, once separate, began to blend. But the world was changing in ways Egypt could not control. In the east, new empires were rising. First the Babylonians, who conquered Assyria, then the Medes, then the Persians, who absorbed them all. The Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great, became the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from India to the Mediterranean. Egypt stood in its path. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses invaded. He brought a massive army across the Sinai Desert. The Egyptian army, led by Pharaoh Psamtik III, met the Persians at Pelusium, a fortress city in the eastern delta. The battle was decisive. The Egyptians were crushed. Cambyses marched to Memphis and claimed the throne. Egypt became a Persian province, a satrapy. Egyptian sources describe Cambyses as a mad tyrant. They claim he desecrated temples, killed the sacred Apis bull, mocked Egyptian religion. Persian sources tell a different story. They describe Cambyses as a legitimate pharaoh who respected Egyptian traditions. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Cambyses was a foreign conqueror. He may have tried to be respectful, but he was still an outsider. For the next 2 centuries, Egypt would oscillate between Persian rule and brief periods of independence. Native Egyptian dynasties occasionally expelled the Persians, but they were always reconquered within a generation or 2. The age of Egyptian independence was ending, but Egyptian culture remained remarkably resilient. The temples still functioned. The priests still performed rituals. The language was still spoken and written. Egypt had lost its political power, but its cultural identity endured. Then, in 332 BCE, everything changed. A young Macedonian king arrived at Egypt's borders. His name was Alexander. Alexander was 24 years old when he entered Egypt. He had already conquered most of the known world. Greece, Anatolia, the Persian heartland, all had fallen to his armies. The Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator. They had no love for the Persians, who had ruled them as conquerors. Alexander, by contrast, showed respect for Egyptian traditions. He made offerings at the temples in Memphis. He consulted oracles. He accepted the title of pharaoh, taking on all the traditional ceremonies and regalia. He traveled to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, deep in the western desert. The journey was dangerous. The desert had killed entire armies, but Alexander made it safely. What happened at the oracle is unknown. The priest's pronouncements were secret, but when Alexander emerged, he claimed the oracle had confirmed he was the son of Amun, a divine king in the Egyptian tradition. Whether he truly believed this or saw it as useful propaganda is debatable. Alexander stayed in Egypt less than a year, but before he left, he founded a city on the Mediterranean coast. He named it after himself, Alexandria. The site was strategic. It had a natural harbor, access to both the Mediterranean and the Nile. Alexander envisioned it as a great city, a bridge between Egypt and the Greek world. He would never see it completed. Alexander left Egypt to continue his conquests. He pushed east into Persia, then into India. He built an empire larger than any before it. But in 323 BCE, he died in Babylon. He was 32 years old. Fever, possibly malaria, possibly poisoning. The exact cause remains disputed. His empire immediately fragmented. His generals, called the Diadochi, carved it up among themselves. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions. He had fought beside Alexander for years, commanding armies, governing territories. Now he took Egypt as his prize. Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh around 305 BCE. He founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Greek in language and culture. The royal court spoke Greek, wrote in Greek, worshipped Greek gods. But they also adopted Egyptian customs. They married their siblings, as Egyptian pharaohs traditionally did. They performed Egyptian rituals, built Egyptian-style temples. This blending of Greek and Egyptian cultures created something unique. The god Serapis, for example, was a fusion of the Egyptian Osiris and the Greek Zeus. He became one of the most important deities of the Hellenistic world. Alexandria became a center of learning and culture. The Ptolemies built the Great Library of Alexandria. It aimed to collect all the knowledge in the world, every book, every scroll, every manuscript. Scholars came from across the Mediterranean to study there. Mathematicians, astronomers, poets, philosophers. Euclid wrote his foundational work on geometry in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Archimedes studied there before returning to Syracuse. The library also housed the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria. It made the scriptures accessible to the wider Greek-speaking world. But the Ptolemaic dynasty was also marked by intrigue and violence. Brothers murdered brothers, mothers poisoned sons, wives betrayed husbands. The court at Alexandria was as dangerous as it was brilliant. The most famous Ptolemaic ruler was the last, Cleopatra VII. She became pharaoh in 51 BCE at the age of 18. She ruled jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, whom she was also required to marry. But Cleopatra had no intention of sharing power. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years who bothered to learn Egyptian. She spoke at least 9 languages. She was intelligent, charismatic, and politically astute. She understood that Egypt's survival depended on Rome. Rome had become the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Anyone who wanted to rule Egypt needed Roman support. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. He was pursuing his rival Pompey, who had fled to Egypt after losing a civil war. But when Pompey landed, the Egyptians killed him, hoping to curry favor with Caesar. They brought Pompey's severed head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar reportedly wept. Pompey had been his son-in-law, his former ally. Cleopatra saw an opportunity. She was in exile at the time, driven out by her brother's advisors, but she needed to meet Caesar. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into the palace rolled up in a carpet. When the carpet was unrolled before Caesar, Cleopatra stepped out. The story may be apocryphal, but what's certain is that Cleopatra impressed Caesar. They became lovers. Caesar supported her claim to the throne. Her brother Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the ensuing conflict. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son. She named him Caesarion, Little Caesar. She declared him co-ruler of Egypt, the heir to both Egyptian and Roman power. But in 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated in Rome, stabbed to death by senators who feared he was becoming too powerful. Cleopatra's position became precarious. Rome descended into another civil war. She needed a new protector. She found one in Mark Antony, one of Caesar's generals, one of the most powerful men in Rome. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Cilicia. She arrived on a magnificent barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. The barge had purple sails, silver oars, and incense burning on deck. Antony was captivated. They became lovers, then political allies. Together, they dreamed of creating an Eastern empire. Egypt would be its heart, Alexandria its capital. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children, twins, a boy and a girl, and later another boy. In a grand ceremony in Alexandria, Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings. He proclaimed Caesarion the rightful heir of Julius Caesar. He divided Roman territories in the east among Cleopatra's children. But they had a rival. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, saw Antony and Cleopatra as threats. He was young, ambitious, ruthless. He controlled the western half of the Roman Empire, and he wanted it all. Octavian launched a propaganda campaign against Antony and Cleopatra. He portrayed Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Rome for an Egyptian seductress. He called Cleopatra a foreign witch who sought to destroy Rome. He convinced the Roman Senate to declare war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. In 31 BCE, the two sides met in battle at Actium, off the coast of Greece. It was a naval engagement. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a fleet of heavy warships. Octavian's fleet was smaller, faster, more maneuverable. The battle went badly for Antony. His ships were outmaneuvered, boarded, set on fire. In the middle of the battle, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke away and fled. Why she did this remains debated. Some historians say she panicked. Others argue she was following a pre-arranged plan to escape with the war chest. Antony, seeing her ships leaving, abandoned his own fleet and followed her. The rest of his navy, leaderless, was destroyed. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Alexandria, but they had lost. Their allies deserted them. Their armies melted away. Octavian pursued them to Egypt. In 30 BCE, he besieged Alexandria. Antony, believing falsely that Cleopatra had already died, stabbed himself with his sword. But the wound wasn't immediately fatal. He was carried to Cleopatra's tomb, where she had barricaded herself. He died in her arms. Cleopatra was captured by Octavian's forces. She was held under guard, prevented from taking her own life. Octavian planned to bring her to Rome, to parade her through the streets as a captive, a trophy of his victory. Cleopatra refused that humiliation. Somehow, she obtained poison. According to legend, it was delivered hidden in a basket of figs, concealed by an asp, a venomous cobra. The cobra was sacred to Egyptian royalty, associated with the goddess Wadjet. To die by its bite was, in a sense, to die as a pharaoh. She arranged herself carefully. She dressed in her royal robes. She placed the crown on her head. When Octavian's men broke into her chamber, they found her dead on her golden couch. 2 of her handmaidens lay dead beside her. She was 39 years old. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a province of Rome. Octavian, who would soon take the title Augustus, declared himself Egypt's new ruler, but he was not called Pharaoh. The age of the pharaohs was over. For 3,000 years, Egypt had been ruled by pharaohs, kings who were also gods, mediators between heaven and earth. Now Egypt was just another province in a vast empire. But Egyptian culture didn't disappear. The temples still functioned, though increasingly neglected. The priests still performed rituals, though their power waned. The language was still spoken, though Greek became dominant in the cities. For centuries more, Egypt remained distinctly Egyptian, but gradually, slowly, the old ways faded. Ancient Egypt lasted more than 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, that's longer than the entire span from the fall of Rome to the present day. It's a civilization that existed for so long that Cleopatra lived closer in time to the invention of the iPhone than to the building of the Great Pyramid. Yet through all that time, something remained constant. The Nile flooded every year. The fields turned black with silt. The sun rose and set in an unchanging rhythm. The Egyptians built their entire worldview around this predictability. They believed order was fundamental to the universe, that the cosmos tended toward balance, that even death itself was just another transformation, another phase in an eternal cycle. Ma'at, order, truth, justice, balance. This was the principle that governed everything. The pharaoh's job was to maintain it. The priest's rituals reinforced it. Every Egyptian, from the highest noble to the humblest farmer, participated in upholding it. When Egypt finally fell, it wasn't because the Nile stopped flooding. It was because the world around Egypt changed. New empires rose with different ideas about power, different gods, different values. But even as Egypt's political power faded, its cultural influence endured. The Greeks absorbed Egyptian mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. The Romans copied Egyptian architecture and imported Egyptian obelisks to decorate their cities. Early Christians found in Egyptian iconography the Ankh, the image of Isis holding the infant Horus, models for their own sacred art. For more than a millennium after Cleopatra's death, people in Egypt still spoke Egyptian, still worshipped Egyptian gods, though increasingly alongside Greek and Roman deities, still wrote in hieroglyphs, though the script evolved into simpler forms. But gradually, those traditions faded. Christianity spread through Egypt in the early centuries of the Common Era. The old temples were closed, some converted into churches. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae. After that, the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost. The last priest who could read them died. The language that had expressed Egyptian thought for millennia fell silent. In the 7th century CE, Arab armies conquered Egypt. Islam became the dominant religion. Arabic replaced Greek as the language of administration. Egyptian culture, what remained of it, merged with Arab culture, creating something new. By the Middle Ages, Egypt had become a land of mysteries. Travelers from Europe and the Islamic world marveled at the pyramids, but they couldn't explain who built them or why. Some thought they were granaries built by the biblical Joseph. Others believed they were astronomical observatories or treasure houses. The hieroglyphs on the monuments were seen as magical symbols, not a language. People believed they contained hidden wisdom, alchemical secrets, prophecies. It wasn't until the 19th century that Egypt's past began to be recovered. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, He brought scholars with his army. They sketched temples, measured pyramids, copied inscriptions. One of his engineers discovered the Rosetta Stone. 24 years later, Jean-François Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphs. For the first time in over a millennium, the ancient Egyptian language could be read. Suddenly, the voices of ancient Egypt could be heard again. Temple inscriptions told of battles and building projects. Tomb texts revealed beliefs about the afterlife. Administrative records showed how the economy functioned, how justice was administered, how daily life was organized. Archaeologists excavated tombs, temples, entire cities. They uncovered treasures like Tutankhamun's tomb. They found the mummies of great pharaohs, Ramesses, Seti, Thutmose. Slowly, painstakingly, the story of ancient Egypt was pieced back together. What we've learned is both familiar and alien. The Egyptians were human, like us. They loved and grieved. They worried about money and health and the future. They told jokes, got drunk, had affairs. But they also believed things we find hard to grasp, that the pharaoh was a living god, that the sun died every night and was reborn every morning, that the heart, not the brain, was the seat of thought and emotion, that death was not an ending, but a doorway to another kind of existence. Their monuments still stand. The pyramids at Giza, weathered but intact. The Temple of Karnak, its columns reaching toward the sky. The Colossi of Abu Simbel, gazing out over the desert. They're weathered now, stripped of their original glory. The pyramids have lost their white limestone casing. The temple's paint has faded. The statues' faces are worn by wind and sand. But they endure. And perhaps that's the most Egyptian thing about them. The Egyptians built for eternity. They wanted their names to last forever, their deeds to be remembered, their souls to live on. In a way, they succeeded. We remember Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid, Hatshepsut, the woman who became pharaoh, Akhenaten, who tried to change everything, Ramesses, who covered Egypt with monuments to himself, Tutankhamun, the forgotten boy king whose tomb revealed the splendor of his age, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, who chose death over humiliation. We walk through their temples, we read their texts, we study their tombs, we try to understand what it meant to be Egyptian. The farmer at the edge of the Nile, the one we met at the beginning, watching the water rise, he couldn't have imagined this. He couldn't have known that thousands of years later, people across the world would know his civilization, would be fascinated by it, would try to understand what made it work, what made it last. But he knew the flood would come. He knew the soil would turn black. He knew the cycle would continue. And for 3,000 years, it did. The Nile still flows north to the Mediterranean. The sun still rises over the eastern desert. The pyramids still stand, silhouettes against the sky. Ancient Egypt is gone. Its language is dead. Its gods forgotten. Its pharaohs dust. But in stone and sand and silence, it remains, waiting to tell its story to anyone who listens. A testament to human ambition, human creativity, human yearning for something that lasts beyond a single lifetime. The Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. To remember someone was to preserve them. So when we speak of ancient Egypt, when we study it, when we marvel at what it achieved, we're doing what the Egyptians themselves wanted. We're keeping them alive. We're ensuring they're not forgotten. And in that sense, ancient Egypt hasn't ended at all. It lives on, in museums and textbooks, in documentaries and novels, in the imagination of everyone who has ever wondered about the pyramids or tried to picture what life was like along the Nile 3,000 years ago. The civilization is gone, but the memory remains. And memory, the Egyptians knew, is a kind of immortality.